So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I'm here for the finale of my series on David Menton's talk about whether birds are dinosaurs. So far he's told us cool things about birds, but given that he's never defined dinosaurs, and gotten things wrong about dinosaurs broadly and birds specifically, he still hasn't even begun to argue that birds aren't dinosaurs. Oh well, let's settle in for the last of it.
What kind of explanations the evolutionists have? Well, they say that the feathers maybe were started out as scales, and then the scales got frayed, and then the frayed scale sort of frayed a second order to produce branching, and then it branched to third order, and somehow all this became a feather.
I guess we're just going to ignore step 1, in which a change in the signaling patterns for keratin growth causes a ring-shaped follicle that invaginates into the skin, resulting in the hollow filament, or that other changes can result in the ring being broken into segments that results in a plume-like structure. None of that. But you know what? I'm not the expert that Darren Naish is, and rather than ramble on about it, here's a link to his talk with Armin about this. You should watch it, because while I'll keep talking about this, I imagine I won't cover it as well as he did.
So the way the argument used to go is that birds evolved from reptiles, and they said reptiles have scales. And by the way, I had a lab tech with a boa constrictor, so I had to bring her the skin in from the boa when he shed his skin, took a picture of it. Evolutionists say something like that, through shredding and fraying and what have you, turned into a bird feather like this.
No, not through shedding and fraying, through mutations that cause changes in the signaling patterns of hormones, which induce the formation of integumentary structures like scales, which are homologous across all amniotes, by the way. Scales, hair, and feathers all grow out of the same embryonic placodes. Plus, the shedding and fraying phrasing makes it sound like scientists are proposing Lamarckian evolution. They're not. No one is suggesting that mechanical abrasion of scales is being inherited by offspring. Further, it's not that birds evolved from reptiles, they are reptiles, just like they're dinosaurs, and just like they're vertebrates.
Man alive, it doesn't take faith to believe that, it takes credulity. Credulity is the willingness to believe without evidence, without any evidence at all, and there's none.
Really, because here's a picture of an American alligator embryo that has been induced to grow feather-like filaments by the same signaling patterns that cause them in birds. Here's a cladogram showing how the relatives of birds, that is, other dinosaurs, exhibit all the predicted stages of feather evolution in exactly the pattern that would be predicted by phylogenetics. And hey, would you look at that? The phi keratins of bird feathers are in fact modified beta keratin, the kind of keratin also found in the scales of crocodiles, the closest living relatives of birds, and which is distinct from the alpha keratin used by mammals to make their floof. Now remind me, again, what evidence besides question begging that we have that feathers were specifically designed by a personal entity? Oh, is it none evidence? All this has happened so far is that we've just been shown cool and or complex things and just had that baldly asserted as evidence of design. Well, it turns out neither coolness nor complexity imply design. Instead, you can use simple math to produce infinitely complex shapes in any number of dimensions you want. But that doesn't mean those shapes were designed. In fact, they just emerged out of the math unbidden by any designer because math has embedded patterns naturally as a result of how it works. Biology does too.
In fact, if you learned in school that feathers evolved from scales, that's all thrown out now.
If by thrown out he meant further supported by the discovery of phylogenetically widely present placodes which are homologous across all of amniota and develop into hair, scales, and feathers, further providing evidence that they all share scale-like common ancestry, then sure, it's been thrown out. But why do I sense that we're talking about Alan Fiducia, the creationist's favorite paleoornithologist? A man who is basically a laughingstock outside of his small band of pseudoscientists.
I don't know of any evolutionists that sincerely believe that feathers come from scales. First of all, they had the wrong organ. They should have been scutes, not scales.
Nope, it's scales.
Scutes have dermal bone structures under them like you see on alligators and bird legs and what have you.
What's the bony underlying tissue under the skin of a bird's foot? Oh, it's just the skeleton. Whereas scutes have a bone that comes from dermal bone formed from mesoderm layers. Guess what? Bird scales are actually modified feathers and don't have an underlying bone.
Feathers are not like scales. Scales are folds like drapery pleats. That's why the whole sheet comes off.
Nope, they're more like thickenings, and in some animals, like snakes, They then fold to create overlapping scales, but that's not typical of most scales, which are today most common, unsurprisingly, in Squamata, the group that includes lizards and amphisbaenians, which you've probably never heard of and which look like worms. Most squamates do not shed scales in a single continuous layer of skin like snakes, instead they tend to shed in patches. But in either case, it's only possible because of enzymes that dissolve the top layer of skin. It's not like their skin is just naturally in loose layers that could pop off. But we don't know how dinosaurs shed their scales or feathers aside from birds, so pointing out that the only very distantly related squamates and birds don't molt in the same way isn't really saying much about where birds belong in taxonomy.
The only reptiles that have scales are what we call squamates. That's the lizards and the snakes.
Hey, I just talked about squamates. Cool. Also, snakes are lizards, and also amphisbaenians, which probably aren't lizards at all.
Alligators and turtles, they have scutes. They're shed individually. I believe dinosaurs have scutes. Everything I've ever seen on dinosaur skin shows these button-like scutes that do not come off as an intact sheet. They come off as individual buttons.
Okay, cool. Well, here's a paper that flatly contradicts that. It's Epidermal Complexity in a Theropod Dinosaur Duravenator from the Upper Jurassic of Germany by Phil R. Bell and Christoph Hendricks. Hey, would you look at that? Figure 1 has numerous pictures of reticulate scales in dinosaurs. Weird. Of course, the paper is linked in the description. Just make sure that you don't use Sci-Hub, that is sci-hub.se, to access it. That would be taking money out of the mouths of the Paleontology Journal editors.
You see, feathers grow out of follicles, just the way hair grows. In fact, a hair follicle and a feather follicle can look pretty similar under the microscope.
I mean, I guess they both fold into the skin, so yeah, they'd look like little dimples with a filament coming out.
All the growth appears at the bottom, down here, called the growth collar. The cells divide. The yellow is a tube coming down from the surface of the skin, basically a tube of epidermis.
Well, highly keratinized epidermis. It's not just straight up the same skin as you've seen between follicles.
And what looks like a kind of a really thick, complicated hair, shown in green here, comes sliding out of this tube to the surface. Now, at first, the hair is formed inside of a shell.
Feather, not hair.
We call it a pin feather. This is a cute picture. It's a white cockatoo that's only 6 weeks of age. And look at its feathers. They look like a bunch of little white pointed structures. These are called pin feathers, and they can be kind of sharp on a bird. You put your finger on the end, they come to a pretty sharp point. The feather develops inside of that shell. And when the shell breaks off, the feather unfolds, and it's arranged like a cylinder inside. A good friend here at the museum, Tim Lovett, did an animation for me that'll help us see how feathers grow. From where we see the brown, this is where the shell has broken off, and these are the barbs of the feather that make up the feather vein. And the feather will grow out of that. You're supposed to be able to get a movie out of that. I don't know why not. There it goes. So the barbs are helically wrapped, and when the shell breaks off, they unwrap and swing out. And that produces the feather vein. Now, we're not showing a lot of the detail. Each of those little lines of barbs have little tiny barbs called barbules.
I'm still waiting for why this makes birds not dinosaurs, especially since many dinosaurs had identical feathers while not being birds, which means presumably they would have had to grow with sheaths, more or less the same as those of a modern bird. This is still just birds cool, therefore not dinosaurs.
Well, there's a lot of different kinds of feathers that birds are able to produce. The big ones that are in the tail are called remiges, like one. The flight feathers are on the wings, and always they're attached to the bones themselves, not to skin. They're attached to bone. At the end of the flight feather, there's a ligament that goes right into the bone with no intervening muscle.
Which form quill knobs on this bone, like seen in this velociraptor ulna. Neat.
And in the case of birds, the primaries are on the bones of the hand, the secondaries are on the bones of the ulna. The radius is the bone on top here. One of my favorite feathers is the one that's listed as 4 there. It's shown way too big. It's out of scale. It should be so tiny you can't even see it compared to the other feathers. It's called a phyloplume. If you've ever plucked a chicken, and I'm finding there are fewer and fewer people who have, but I remember my mother used to pluck chickens to cook them. And when she got all the feathers off, there were like little tiny hairs left. You could actually see these hairs if you look carefully. She held the bird over the gas stove to burn these off. And once you had those off, the bird was ready to be cooked.
One trick is to tell them stories that don't go anywhere. Like the time I caught the...
Okay, Grandpa Simpson. Now, what was the point of this?
Those little tiny hairs don't grow up to be big feathers or anything. They stay tiny, and they're called phyloplumes, and they are believed to be sensory structures. They are very tiny, they're embedded among the bigger feathers, and when the feathers are moved, as you know, the feathers have muscles, the bird has to get some information of what position is this feather in versus that one, because in flight that all has to be adjusted. That information is presumably being picked up by these little tiny phyloplumes picking up the signal, sending it to the brain. Bird then can adjust its feathers in flight.
All that, and it's just a gee whiz, birds are neat statement. I mean, I'm not surprised, and honestly, given how much of this speech is just this, I'm not even sure why I have requests to cover it, but alas, I do, and here I am now. Some 20 pages deep.
Feather number 6 down there is a down feather. You've all seen those. They're particularly good for warmth, whether you're trying to brood eggs or have a sleeping bag. And this is the way a down feather looks in a scanning electron microscope. What it is a feather shaft with a bunch of barbs, but the barbs don't have any little barbs called barbules. They're just separate. So it traps a lot of air.
Oh, so you mean basically joining filamentous feathers often identified as stage 2 protofeathers, and the kind of thing that's known in virtually all parts of Dinosauria, including ornithischians, the dinosaurs least like birds. Dinosaurs from heterodontosaurids to tyrannosaurids have these feathers. This is not a point about why birds are not dinosaurs. Far from it, this is a reason why we know birds are dinosaurs.
Here's the basic anatomy of what we call a pennaceous feather. These are the most complicated ones.
Which are found in dinosaur groups besides birds, including Ornithomimosauria, Oviraptorosauria, Dromaeosauridae, and Troodontids.
You have the shaft, or rachis. It's in position 1 there. And then for each of these shafts, you would have 2 veins, one on each side. So you see the 2 veins listed. And then each of these veins, for an average size feather, would have about 400 barbs coming out of it. Those are the things you saw unfolding out of the follicle. And the barbs protrude from the shaft, and from each barb, there are little barbs called barbules. This is getting ridiculous.
I'm not sure what's ridiculous about iterative morphology. That's one of the more simple ways that organisms can grow. Essentially a fractal pattern where the main pattern repeats several steps down. Basically, it's the same idea as a Coke snowflake, but rather than iterating the rule infinitely, you only do it like 3 or 4 times.
And in the next picture over here, you see a barb here, and it has barbules. The brown barbules are what we call anterior barbels. The yellow ones, it's just a color we've put in to keep them separate, are called posterior barbels. And the anterior barbels have little hooks.
Yep, this is basically another iteration of the pattern.
And so each anterior barbel has about 20 hooks. Well, do the math on this and figure out how many hooklets there would be in a swan. The number is outrageous.
Okay, everybody playing bingo at home, we just got big number, therefore God. That's big number, therefore God. Everyone, make sure you mark it on your bingo card or your card won't be accepted.
All of this hooks together, we used to think it was like Velcro. You know, you just have a bunch of hooks here and some loops here, and you just sort of moosh the 2 together and hope a bunch of the hooks grab the loops. It turns out the feather is not like Velcro. The feather is like a zipper. And when that bird runs its beak with its lubricant out the feather, starting from the base of the feather, all these little hooks zip up like a zipper. Every hook zips. You don't skip anything like you do in Velcro.
Neat, but that's common to a wide range of dinosaurs, namely Maniraptoriforms. So while yeah, it's cool, it's actually yet another reason to say birds are dinosaurs. After this, it's just scanning electron microscope pictures of feather anatomy and demonstrating that yes, what he just said is true. And in the interest of time and my own sanity, I'm skipping that.
It's no wonder. When Charles Darwin was once asked about the peacock's tail, whether his evolutionary idea could explain that, Darwin said that the sight of a peacock's tail made him sick when he looked at it.
Okay, once again for you bingo players, we have Darwin quote mine. That's Darwin quote mine, thank you. But let's take a look. So according to the implication from Menton, Darwin couldn't understand how a feather could evolve, and his example was the peacock tail fan. So let's take a look at this because it's from a letter from Charles Darwin to Asa Gray dated the 3rd of April, 1860. In it he says, "It is curious that I remember well the time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over. But I have got over this stage of complaint, and now small, trifling particulars of structure often make me very uncomfortable. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." That's it. That's all it says about the peacock tail. So, one, he's perfectly happy with explanations of the evolution of the eye, but something about not feathers, but peacock feathers makes him sick. Let's see if we can find out what that is. Some 11 years later, in 1871, Darwin published what is probably his second most famous book, The Descent of Man. In it we find this passage on page 209. "We are, however, concerned only with sexual selection. This depends on the advantage which certain individuals have over others of the same sex and species solely in respect of reproduction. When, as in the case mentioned above, the two sexes differ in structure and relation to different habits of life, they no doubt have been modified through natural selection, and by the inheritance limited to one and the same sex." And the heading for chapter 14 is "Choice exerted by the female. Length of courtship, unpaired birds, mental qualities and taste for the beautiful, preference or antipathy shown by the female for particular males, variability of birds, variation sometimes abrupt, laws of variation, formation of ocelli, gradations of character, case of peacock, Argus pheasant, and Eurosticte." It's not feathers per se that Darwin had trouble with in 1860. It is in fact sexual selection, which he had not really figured out by that time, but which, given a decade or more to research, he had very well figured out. David Menton was just lying about Darwin, which is odd because while I did spend the time to check into the sources and whatnot on this, it doesn't really matter what Darwin said or thought or wrote. He's still not the Pope of Science. His words aren't gospel. He was one of the first people to get some important things right, that's it. No one believes in evolution because he's their great prophet and he declared it to be so.
Speaking of Darwin, how do evolutionists tell us that dinosaurs have become birds?
Speaking of Darwin, says something that's nothing about Darwin. Classic creationist silliness. But it's the same way anything else evolves. Natural selection, natural variation, mutation, sexual selection. You know, all the classics. Is this like a question about the particulars of the evolution of the characteristics unique to bird? Well, since pretty much all of them are skeletal, like bone fusion and a killed sternum, we know that mutations can and do cause bone fusion. It happens in humans all the time. And we know that mutations can and do cause the size and shape of bones to vary. Those two things explain the bone fusion and the keeled sternum. Beaks are just extensive keratinization of the skin, and we know that's not something that's inexplicable. The loss of teeth is the kind of thing creationists like to pretend happens, but isn't evolution because it's a loss. Plus, we have transitional forms for all of these things, like Sinosauropteryx to Gallimimus to Caudipteryx to Anchiornis to enantiornithine birds through to crown birds. But I don't actually know what's supposed to be mysterious about this.
Well, they say it all happened by random chance through random mutations and natural selection.
You know, selection is fundamentally non-random.
It started out with a dinosaur at the bottom, like you're seeing in the picture here.
No. That looks like a generic Jurassic Park theropod-based monster. Let's just start with something like this. A troodon, already full of feathers, but not a bird, and about as close to aviale, that is birds in the broad sense, as you can get without actually being in aviale.
And this wasn't just any kind of dinosaur, it's the kind of dinosaurs that walk around on two legs, the theropod. You see the word there, theropod dinosaurs.
Wow, that is a terrible representation. What even is that supposed to be? It looks like a naked Deinonychosaur of some kind, but the feet are wrong, the wrists are broken, and again, Deinonychosaurs were fully feathered. Also, has it got a mammal-style nose? What is even happening? Did they just hire a guy who'd never drawn a dinosaur before?
Unfortunately, remember, the theropod dinosaurs are not the ones with the bird hip, they have the lizard hip.
Unfortunate or not, by the time we're in Penoraptora, that is animals with modern-style feathers, but many of whom are not birds in the least, the pubis bone in many organisms no longer points anterioventrally. Instead, it points ventrally or posterioventrally. You know, like a bird. And again, we have transitional forms for this too.
Not that the bird hip looks that much like a bird anyway.
They are all synsacra, so it looks like it in many ways. Also, birds, like dinosaurs, and unlike any other animals, have a ring of bone for the hip socket, rather than a little cup. Weird that.
And by the way, can you see the knee okay? Is that showing up for you, the knee there? And notice it's a small theropod dinosaur.
I'd call that medium-sized, but glad we're back to the knees. Yes, long-tailed dinosaurs and short-tailed dinosaurs like birds all balance at the knees, but the short tails of birds shift the center of mass forward on the torso, so they need to swing their knees forward in order to just compensate. But again, as you're seeing on screen, If you just put a fake tail on them, suddenly that knee drops down to the basal position where the femur is subvertical rather than almost horizontal.
Some theropod dinosaurs are much bigger. In fact, everybody's favorite dinosaur, at least among kids, is the T-Rex. And the T-Rex is a theropod dinosaur. They say they were so nasty, even their own moms didn't like them.
Who said that? Is that supposed to be a joke? You know what's not a good joke? Just saying for no reason and with no setup that some animal species has bad mothers.
But walks on two legs, balances from his hip, not from his knee. You have no trouble seeing dinosaur knees.
Indeed, it did balance from the knee, but that long tail put that under the hip. Just because why not, here's a little bird with a plunger on its butt again. Notice how you can see its knee when it's not under the wing and obscured by feathers. Neato! You can see bird knees.
But can you imagine what it would take to convince yourself that that thing you're looking at right there is a close relative of a hummingbird?
Depends on what you mean by close. If you did genetic tests, you'd probably find that they're about as similar as a human and a wombat. Dinosauria is a huge and very diverse group whose common ancestor existed in the Triassic. But what would it take to convince me that it's a relative of a bird, humming or otherwise? I don't know, shared apomorphies like an open acetabulum, a femoral head distinctly offset from the shaft, an asymmetric trochanter of the femur, a large number of sacral vertebrae strongly fused to the iliac bones. Conveniently, all of that is present in both.
I'm not capable of it. I lack the credulity. It's not possible.
Ah yes, lacking the credulity to believe conclusive scientific evidence, but having the credulity to believe in a global flood that left no evidence. Seems reasonable.
What is a dinosaur anyway?
Are you f***ing kidding me right now? After all this time, he finally got to the point. This is where the talk should have started, not the thing he only got to with about 15 minutes left, much of which we already know is just going to be commercial for further AIG stuff they want you to buy. In fact, of the remaining time without commercials, we have about 8 minutes to finally talk about the only thing that matters. What is a dinosaur?
Dinosaurs have been known for a long time before 1841, but in 1841, an English anatomist, Sir Richard Owen, was the first to really describe what was unique about a dinosaur. And that is, dinosaurs were the only reptiles that walked on top of their legs, the way we do.
No, they're not. That was also common to the wider Ava metatarsalia, including dinosauromorphs like Lagirpaton, but also pterosaurs and their relatives like Scleromochlus. Further, Pilerorex pseudoseuchians existed in the Triassic, and while their hip anatomy was quite different from that of dinosaurs, they were also walking with erect limb postures.
You might say, well, where do the other reptiles walk? They're like this lizard you see in the middle here. Elbows out, knees out, belly draggers.
Okay, yeah, just dragging the belly. Oh, what's this? A galloping crocodilian? Just ignore that.
So only the dinosaur walks straight on top of its legs. Look at the other. These are the four orders of living reptiles.
Class Reptilia is basically defunct now, because by excluding birds but including crocodilians, it's paraphyletic. Nowadays, works in the field refer to its members more broadly as diapsids, and birds are diapsids just as much as the Komodo dragon or the alligator. Now, there are animals closer to modern reptiles than to other animals in the larger group Sauropsida, which are also sometimes called reptiles, but if we're just looking at the ancestry of extant animals, then it's reasonable to equate Diapsida with Reptilia, which again makes birds reptiles.
And they're all belly draggers. They don't walk on top of their legs like a dinosaur. The crocodiles walk that way.
Except when they high walk, in which case they do swing their legs under the body, like a mammal or a dinosaur, which, makes sense since crocodilians are the closest living relatives to dinosaurs.
The lizards, of course, the snakes, they don't have legs at all.
Snakes are a group of lizards. They're not separate from lizards. And they're not the only legless lizards, nor are lizards the only squamates without legs. The aforementioned amphisbaenians don't have them either. Okay, well, the Mexican amphisbaenians of genus Bipes have 2 front legs, but none of the others do. Now, some recent work has suggested that maybe amphisbaenians are actually themselves lizards rather than a sister group. Right now, that's still being worked out, and until that becomes the new consensus, I'll keep going with the traditional classification of them being the sister group to lizards. In case you're curious, if they're lizards, they're probably a kind of wall lizard, but that's a big if. Being small and subterranean with a relatively small range, amphisbaenians are relatively poorly studied, so there's a lot we don't know about them. I now realize I'm just talking about little worm guys so I don't have to keep listening to Menton. But that's not why you're here, so I guess he can have the floor again.
Testudines are the turtles and tortoises and what have you. And finally, Sphenodontia is an interesting one. It's a living fossil. We see them in the fossil record, and evolutionists say that they're 200 million years old, the ones we see in the fossil record. Yet today we have the very same looking creature, at least as far as we can tell, doesn't appear to have evolved or gone anywhere.
Really? Well, odd then how we don't have any Triassic fossils of Sphenodon punctatus, the tuatara, in the fossil record. Instead, we have other rhynchocephalians, which, while similar to the tuatara, hence its inclusion in the group, aren't identical to it.
And there's only one species.
Yep, that's what happens before a group goes extinct. You get a last species. When it's gone, as it almost certainly will be at some point, then the rhynchocephalia will be lost forever.
It's like humans. There's only one species of humans.
And there's only one species of Komodo dragon, and only one species of Asian elephant. I'm not sure what the point is. Humans, unlike tuataras, have living members of their family, Homininidae, in the great apes, fellow members of their superfamily, Hominoidea, in the gibbons, and fellow members of their infraorder in baboons. They have fellow members of their suborder in capuchin monkeys, and fellow members of their order in lemurs. The tuatara stands alone as the only living member of the order Rhynchocephalia.
We don't have several species of humans. There's only one species of Sphenodontia. They say there's two subspecies, but they're capable of interbreeding.
Yep, subspecies are capable of interbreeding. That's kind of one of the big reasons you call them subspecies and not separate species.
Anyway, this is one of the early finds, very exciting to evolutionists, just a year or two after Darwin published The Origin of Species. In 1860, they discovered Archaeopteryx. It was found in Bavaria, and again, using the sort of dates evolutionists come up with, it was supposed to be 140 million years old. That makes it as old as most dinosaurs are, certainly.
I mean, that puts it around the end of the Jurassic, so it's that old. Younger than the older dinosaurs and older than the younger ones. I don't know what it would mean for it to be as old as most dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't all just pop onto the scene at one moment in geological time.
And people argued over whether it was a bird or a dinosaur.
Yep, because its skeleton is unambiguously that of a dinosaur. In fact, specimens without feathers had been misidentified as the dinosaur Compsognathus.
And of course, this was very interesting because evolutionists were looking for transitional forms, something going from A to B. And this seemed to be it. It definitely had feathers. There's no arguing about that.
Well, Fred Hoyle tried to argue about that, but his take was so dumb he was metaphorically laughed out of the room. That didn't stop Kent Hovind from adopting his ideas on Archaeopteryx, though.
If you look here, feathers on the wing here and up here, and look at all these feathers on the tail, and look how long the tail is.
Very much not like a bird as they have been described in this whole talk.
That really threw people. They said birds have a little short tail. Archaeopteryx has a long tail, therefore it's really kind of a dinosaur.
It also doesn't have a keeled sternum, a beak, fused wing fingers, fused metatarsals, a completely posterior projecting pubis, and it has teeth. So based on the definitions we were given in this very talk, it's not a bird.
Now, Sir Richard Owen, the anatomist I told you about that discovered or gave dinosaurs their name, he said that it was unequivocally a bird.
He said that when the head was found, it would have a toothless beak like all birds. He was wrong.
And there were others who agreed with him. But Thomas Huxley, he was Darwin's big defender, often called Darwin's bulldog. He said that it's clearly a feathered dinosaur, and he said it's a dead ringer for another dinosaur by the name of Compsognathus.
Yep, so much so that an Archaeopteryx specimen was actually referred to Compsognathus at one point. The Eichstatt specimen, JM2257, was discovered in the 1950s, and it took until the 1980s for scientists to realize that they had an Archaeopteryx on their hands. So this wasn't just a similarity noticed by some guys a century and a half ago. This is a modern thing that still persists. Archaeopteryx is so indistinguishable in its skeleton from definitely non-bird dinosaurs that it can be easily confused for one.
Well, let's just take a look at Compsognathus. Look at the tail.
Yeah, it's long, as is Archaeopteryx's. And we don't actually have all of Compsognathus' tail. We're missing the distalmost portions, so we don't even know how long it is.
All those vertebrae in that tail have these long spines, dorsal processes here and ventral processes called hemal arches. They have transverse processes.
Archaeopteryx had those too, and in both organisms they reduce in size distally. Now the specimen that we're shown is the Berlin specimen, where the hemal and neural arches and transverse processes are largely not preserved. The Eichstatt specimen shows them more clearly, and they're very evident in the Solnhofen specimen, which was also mistaken for Compsognathus. So I'm glad that David Menton thought he could reliably tell the difference between animals in the form of museum reconstructions that fill in missing anatomy. The fact remains that experts don't find it so easy, and you know, if you and the experts disagree, there's a chance you're right, and all the people who've dedicated decades to the study of their field are wrong, but there's a much higher chance that you're wrong.
This is all muscle and ligaments and tendons here. This is a heavy, powerful tail like you'd see on an alligator.
It's probably reasonably heavy, but it's not all that powerful. so that the tail, like many theropods relatively close to birds, was fairly stiff, and as you go distally, more and more of the tendons were reduced and ossified, making the tail a bit of a stiff rod used for balance. This is also the case in Archaeopteryx, although yes, the tail of the latter is more gracile than the former. But remember, we have no reason to say that tail gracility, or lack thereof, is a determiner of being a dinosaur. Menton didn't say it was, and I've never heard anyone else say it is either.
Whereas the tail in Archaeopteryx, the feathers went right in and attached to the bone that formed the core of the tail.
Maybe distally, but again, we don't have the distal portion of Compsognathus' tail anyway, so who knows what was going on there?
And these bones here were all fused to one another, so this would have behaved like a stick.
Again, common in Maniraptora, the group of dinosaurs to which birds belong, but not at all unique to Archaeopteryx.
Not like a whip, like an alligator tail, but more like a stick.
I wonder if Menton knew that Compsognathus belonged to a group of theropods called Tetanurae, which were literally named for their stiff tails. Probably not. He was kind of a mendacious idiot.
So, no, Compsognathus could not be confused, and Compsognathus had pubic bones that faced the front.
Actually, its pubis faced ventrally, not anterioventrally, and was in almost the same position as Archaeopteryx, which had a very mild posterior tilt. In fact, their hips were very similar, and they're so similar that multiple times experts have confused them. But I'm glad that a man with a PhD in human anatomy thought he could tell the difference.
These are the ischial bones that are in the back here. And it would have balanced from the hip, because it had as much weight behind as in front.
It again, like all dinosaurs, balanced from the knees, but in the case of both Archaeopteryx and Compsognathus, that would probably have put their femurs more vertical than in modern dinosaurs.
Well, that's the way Compsognathus would look compared to a chicken, to a large rooster.
Well, that's about the size of a small one, but we actually don't know much about the integument of Compsognathus, or really the exact placement of Compsognathidae within Tetanurae. Some workers say it's the basal most branching member of Coelurosauria, but others have it as Maniraptoran. If the former, then it probably was covered by downy feathers. If the later, it may have had pennaceous feathers and looked for all the world like a funny bird.
And again, you can see the knees.
You can see the knee because he chose for it to be depicted that way. He could have just as reasonably covered Compsognathus in feathers and given it arms that weren't broken, which would have been able to obscure the knees.
We used to think that we'd never find very many fossil birds, but boy, has that story changed. Over the last 20 or 30 years or so, in the northeastern part of China, in an area called Liaoning Province, right near North Korea there, they've found 60 species of plants, 300 species of invertebrates, and 90 species of vertebrates, including amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and lots of fossil birds. In fact, the most common vertebrate in Liaoning Province is this one right here.
An animal which, according to Menton's criteria, isn't even a bird. It didn't have a keeled sternum, it had unfused wing fingers, and it didn't even have fused metatarsals. Plus, its pubis is not pointing posteriorly. In fact, it's more ventral than anything, but with only a small posterior angle. Literally, the only thing this animal has in common with the birds we were told about at the beginning is a beak, a short tail, and feathers. Everything else we were told was important to being a bird, like the unique coracoid, the aforementioned bone fusion, etc., is just not here. If Menton had a shred of internal consistency or intellectual honesty, he'd have to admit that it isn't a bird. Unfortunately, he never did.
Here's a 130 million, again, I don't accept these days, 130 million-year-old bird that was found in that area recently. And it's Archaeornithera. And again, it has every component we would reasonably expect to find in a bird, including feathers.
To be fair, we are getting closer. It does have fused metatarsals and probably some wing finger fusion, but we can't say about the keel, so this, for Menton, is probably a bird, but maybe not.
But what about the feathered dinosaurs? That's what you're wondering about. This would be one of the feathered dinosaurs here, Zhenyang Long.
Well, the others were feathered dinosaurs too, since we were never shown how they didn't fit into the definition of dinosaur, despite not really fitting Menton's definition of birds. But yes, Zhenyang Long is also a feathered dinosaur.
And it was found in that northeastern part of China, said to be 125 million years old. Notice it does indeed have a long tail.
Yep, shorter than Archaeopteryx and with more stiffening ossification of tendons, so if anything, this should argue for Menton that it's a bird, but he's so inconsistent that who knows what he'll say anymore.
But notice again, the feathers come all the way into the bone and attached by ligaments to the bone. There is no muscle in his tail.
There is at the proximal end. In fact, you can see the neural and humeral arches that help support attachment for tail and leg muscles right there in the picture he showed on screen.
All the vertebrae from here out are all linked together so we would form a solid rod. and it would all sort of behave like something solid that bent down at the base, like this, not bent along its length, but just from the base. Those were the only movable vertebrae, and we can see those movable vertebrae right in this region. The rest is a stick. So this is just like Archaeopteryx. It has a long tail, there's no weight to it, and look where the legs go and attach, right here.
At the hip? That's kind of where all animals with hind legs attach their hind legs.
This would never balance if it didn't walk from its knees.
Like a dinosaur. Got it.
So here you can see the feathers in the wing.
Wait, hold up. Those fused wing fingers weren't fused at all. And wasn't this the guy who said this?
So lots of bone fusion, and one place to see it is there in the hand. All those many bones that make up our hand pretty much are reduced to sort of 3 fingers.
So according to Menton, this can't be a bird. Weird, it's almost like it's a dinosaur with some bird-like features, the kind of thing you'd expect to find if birds were in fact dinosaurs and had evolved from more basal theropods. Weird.
I had our artist draw this so-called dromaeosaur, which is generally considered a dinosaur,
Because it meets literally every single criterion for being a dinosaur, right?
as a bird, and that would balance. And this certainly looks like a synsacrum up in this area here.
Yet again, so it's a dinosaur, right?
That would balance, but if you tried to stand it up so it walked like a dinosaur, bringing the balance point to the hip,
So unlike a dinosaur, okay.
it would fall on its nose. So I conclude that dromaeosaurs
That being the group that includes animals like Velociraptor.
are birds, and that would include velociraptors, deinonychus, and microraptors.
I see the game. He just realized that you can't really still argue that raptors didn't have feathers. So even though we just in this talk heard a bunch of criteria for being a bird that dromaeosaurs don't fit, they're just birds by fiat now, while also meeting all the criteria for dinosaurs. If this isn't an admission that Menton had no way to distinguish birds from among dinosaurs, I have no idea what would be. I'll also note that to this day the Creation Museum still displays scaly Jurassic Park dromaeosaurs. Also note that in the art Menton is using, he just decided to give dromaeosaurs beaks, even though none of them had it, and he ignored the giant sickle-shaped claws on their second toe, because he knows that wouldn't sell the bird look very well.
So when a dinosaur has feathers, it is a bird.
Let's hear that again.
So when a dinosaur has feathers, it is a bird.
Just one more time to let it really sink in.
So when a dinosaur has feathers, it is a bird.
Thanks, Dave. Good to know that he never actually had any criteria for distinguishing birds from dinosaurs, and that all that time talking about muscle attachment, shoulder girdle arrangement, bone fusion, etc. was even more of a waste of time than it first appeared to be.
And birds are not dinosaurs. I hope I've convinced you of that.
Well, he literally had just said the opposite, so no, I'm not convinced of that. Not in the least. But either way, immediately after this, he just starts talking about Bible verses with birds in them, and then just asks people to give AIG money by buying books. I'm not here for any of that, so that's where we'll end this. Thank you for watching and suffering with me. This one was extra painful. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and tell me what you liked most in the comments. If you didn't like it, hit dislike and tell me what was wrong with it, again, in the comments. Either way, I hope you subscribe and turn on all notifications with the bell icon so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Benthoven, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabity Babbity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. The people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if an annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.